On the Rainy River by Tim O'Brien. Tim O'Brien was born in 1946 in Austin, Minnesota, to an insurance salesman and an elementary school teacher. Both of his parents were veterans. His father had been in the Navy in Iwo Jima and Okinawa during World War II, and his mother had served with the WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. As a child, O'Brien spent time reading in the county library, learning to perform magic tricks, and playing baseball. His first piece of fiction was called Timmy of the Little League. O'Brien attended Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, majoring in political science. When he graduated in 1968, he hoped to join the State Department as a diplomat, but instead, just weeks after graduation, he was drafted into the Army. O'Brien nearly fled to Canada during his training in Fort Lewis, Washington. He planned to desert, but he went only as far as Seattle before turning back. In 1969, at the age of 22, he went to Quang Ngai, Vietnam, first as a rifleman and later as a radio-telephone operator and clerk. He completed a 13-month tour of duty, earning a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. After his return to the United States in 1970, O'Brien enrolled in Harvard's doctoral program in government and spent his summers working as an intern for the Washington Post. He became a full-time national affairs reporter, covering Senate hearings and political events. Several years later, O'Brien left both his graduate work and his job at the Post to pursue a career as a writer. In a memoir, 7 novels, and many short stories, O'Brien has explored the question of moral responsibility. Who is responsible for the 58,000 American soldiers and more than 1 million Vietnamese people killed in battle between 1965 and 1975? On the Rainy River describes a young man who has to choose between going to Vietnam and fleeing to Canada to evade the draft. He blames the war on everyone: the president, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the knee-jerk patriots in his hometown, but ultimately takes his place among them, choosing to go to war. His decision precipitates the events of the book, The Things They Carried, just as O'Brien's own conflicted decision to go to war set the course of his life, first as a soldier and then as a writer. The Things They Carried was a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. O'Brien's other significant books include If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up, and Ship Me Home, Going After Chikado, The Nuclear Age, and In the Lake of the Woods. Tim O'Brien lives in Texas with his wife and son. He teaches creative writing at Texas State University. This is one story I've never told before. Not to anyone. Not to my parents, not to my brother or sister, not even to my wife. To go into it, I've always thought, would only cause embarrassment for all of us, a sudden need to be elsewhere, which is the natural response to a confession. Even now, I'll admit, the story makes me squirm. For more than 20 years, I've had to live with it, feeling the shame, trying to push it away. And so by this act of remembrance, by putting the facts down on paper, I'm hoping to relieve at least some of the pressure on my dreams. Still, it's a hard story to tell. All of us, I suppose, like to believe that in a moral emergency we will behave like the heroes of our youth, bravely and forthrightly, without thought of personal loss or discredit. Certainly that was my conviction back in the summer of 1968. Tim O'Brien, a secret hero, the Lone Ranger. If the stakes ever became high enough, if the evil were evil enough, if the good were good enough, I would simply tap a secret reservoir of courage that had been accumulating inside me over the years. Courage, I seem to think, comes to us in finite quantities, like an inheritance, and being frugal and stashing it away and letting it earn interest We steadily increase our moral capital in preparation for that day when the account must be drawn down." It was a comforting theory. It dispensed with all those bothersome little acts of daily courage. It offered hope and grace to the repetitive coward. It justified the past while amortizing the future. In June of 1968, a month after graduating from Macalester College, I was drafted to fight a war I hated. I was 21 years old. Young, yes, and politically naive, but even so, the American war in Vietnam seemed to me wrong. Certain blood was being shed for uncertain reasons. I saw no unity of purpose, no consensus on matters of philosophy or history or law. The very facts were shrouded in uncertainty. Was it a civil war? A war of national liberation or simple aggression? Who started it? And when? And why? What really happened to the USS Maddox on that dark night in the Gulf of Tonkin? Was Ho Chi Minh a communist stooge or a nationalist savior, or both, or neither? What about the Geneva Accords? What about Seattle and the Cold War? What about dominoes? America was divided on these and 1,000 other issues, and the debate had spilled out across the floor of the United States Senate and into the streets, and smart men in pinstripes could not agree on even the most fundamental matters of public policy. The only certainty that summer was moral confusion. It was my view then, and still is, that you don't make war without knowing why. Knowledge, of course, is always imperfect, but it seemed to me that when a nation goes to war, it must have reasonable confidence in the justice and imperative of its cause. You can't fix your mistakes. Once people are dead, you can't make them undead. In any case, those were my convictions, and back in college I had taken a modest stand against the war. Nothing radical, no hothead stuff, just ringing a few doorbells for Gene McCarthy, composing a few tedious, uninspired editorials for the campus newspaper. Oddly, though, it was almost entirely an intellectual activity. I brought some energy to it, of course, but it was the energy that accompanies almost any abstract endeavor. I felt no personal danger. I felt no sense of an impending crisis in my life. Stupidly, with a kind of smug removal that I can't begin to fathom, I assumed that the problems of killing and dying did not fall within my special province. The draft notice arrived on June 17th, 1968. It was a humid afternoon, I remember, cloudy and very quiet, and I'd just come in from a round of golf. My mother and father were having lunch out in the kitchen. I remember opening the letter, scanning the first few lines, feeling the blood go thick behind my eyes. I remember a sound in my head. It wasn't thinking, just a silent howl. A million things all at once. I was too good for this war. Too smart, too compassionate, too everything. It couldn't happen. I was above it. I had the world dicked. Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude, and president of the student body, and a full ride scholarship for grad studies at Harvard. A mistake, maybe. A foul up in the paperwork. I was no soldier. I hated Boy Scouts. I hated camping out. I hated dirt and tents and mosquitoes. The sight of blood made me queasy, and I couldn't tolerate authority, and I didn't know a rifle from a slingshot. I was a liberal, for Christ's sake. If they needed fresh bodies, why not draft some back to the Stone Age hawk, or some dumb jingo in his hard hat and bomb Hanoi button, or one of LBJ's pretty daughters, or Westmoreland's whole handsome family, nephews and nieces and baby grandson. There should be a law, I thought. If you support a war, if you think it's worth the price, that's fine. But you have to put your own precious fluids on the line. You have to head for the front and hook up with an infantry unit and help spill the blood. And you have to bring along your wife, or your kids, or your lover. A law, I thought. I remember the rage in my stomach. Later, it burned down to a smoldering self-pity, then to numbness. At dinner that night, my father asked what my plans were. "Nothing," I said. "Wait." Oops. I spent the summer of 1968 working in an Armour meatpacking plant in my hometown of Worthington, Minnesota. The plant specialized in pork products, and for 8 hours a day I stood on a quarter-mile assembly line, more properly, a disassembly line, removing blood clots from the necks of dead pigs. My job title, I believe, was declotter. After slaughter, the hogs were decapitated, split down the length of the belly, pried open, eviscerated, and strung up by the hind hocks on a high conveyor belt. Then gravity took over. By the time a carcass reached my spot on the line, the fluids had mostly drained out, everything except for the thick clots of blood in the neck and upper chest cavity. To remove the stuff, I used a kind of water gun. The machine was heavy, maybe 80 pounds, and was suspended from the ceiling by a heavy rubber cord. There was some bounce to it, an elastic up and down give, and the trick was to maneuver the gun with your whole body, not lifting with the arms, just letting the rubber cord do the work for you. At one end was a trigger. At the muzzle end was a small nozzle and a steel roller brush. As a carcass passed by, you'd lean forward and swing the gun up against the clots and squeeze the trigger, all in one motion. And the brush would whirl and water would come shooting out, and you'd hear a quick splattering sound as the clots dissolved into a fine red mist. It was not pleasant work. Goggles were a necessity, and a rubber apron. But even so, it was like standing for 8 hours a day under a lukewarm blood shower. At night, I'd go home smelling of pig. It wouldn't go away. Even after a hot bath, scrubbing hard, the stink was always there. Like old bacon or sausage, a dense, greasy pig stink that soaked deep into my skin and hair. Among other things, I remember, it was tough getting dates that summer. I felt isolated. I spent a lot of time alone, and there was also that draft notice tucked away in my wallet. In the evenings, I'd sometimes borrow my father's car and drive aimlessly around town, feeling sorry for myself, thinking about the war and the pig factory and how my life seemed to be collapsing towards slaughter. I felt paralyzed. All around me, the options seemed to be narrowing, as if I were hurtling down a huge black funnel, the whole world squeezing in tight. There was no happy way out. The government had ended most graduate school deferments. The waiting lines for the National Guard and Reserves were impossibly long. My health was solid. I didn't qualify for CO status. No religious grounds, no history as a pacifist. Moreover, I could not claim to be opposed to a war as a matter of general principle. There were occasions, I believed, when a nation was justified in using military force to achieve its ends, to stop a Hitler or some comparable evil, and I told myself that, in such circumstances, I would have willingly marched off to the battle. The problem, though, was that a draft board did not let you choose your war. Beyond all this, or at the very center, was the raw fact of terror. I did not want to die. Not ever. But certainly not then, not there, not in a wrong war. Driving up Main Street, past the courthouse and the Ben Franklin store, I sometimes felt the fear spreading inside me like weeds. I imagined myself dead. I imagined myself doing things I could not do. Charging an enemy position, taking aim at another human being. At some point in mid-July, I began thinking seriously about Canada. The border lay a few hundred miles north, an 8-hour drive. Both my conscience and my instincts were telling me to make a break for it. Just take off and run like hell and never stop. In the beginning, the idea seemed purely abstract, the word Canada printing itself out in my head, but after a time I could see particular shapes and images, the sorry details of my future, a hotel room in Winnipeg, a battered old suitcase, my father's eyes as I tried to explain myself over the telephone.